Two major world events made headlines this week as terrorists struck an airport and train station in Belgium, and President Obama made an historic visit to Cuba. Belgium's competency in dealing with security concerns is at issue after not probing a suspect in the Paris attacks about future threats. Meanwhile, President Obama became the first U.S. president since 1928 to visit Cuba. Patty, it was a surreal day seeing President Cuba at a baseball game in Cuba. You can stop right there. But then getting interviewed by ESPN about terrorist attacks in Belgium. It was, from everything we've seen this week, what's your take?
Well, there were a lot of images that were really tough to look at this week. First, it's horrible that it takes a tragedy of this magnitude to actually knock the presidential campaign out of the news for about 3 seconds. It didn't take long because all of a sudden then we were hearing about whether or not Trump would use the nuclear option. But the irony of watching the president go to Cuba, which was 50 years ago our arch enemy, the worst thing we could possibly imagine, and now you have the enemy looking like it can come within us at any time, and certainly within Belgium. So it was really a time for retrospection and thinking about, it was actually easier to think about what we wanted to do with our Cold War enemies compared to how do you really track ISIS. Obviously, Belgium authorities had some problems with it. They're talking about different languages that are used, that they didn't communicate as well with other European law enforcement agencies, that they're completely open borders, which makes it tougher. But obviously, you need to share information more. You need to crack down. How America's going to protect itself, too, it's hard to know. But I don't think some of the solutions we've heard so far in the presidential campaign are the way to go.
Craig, as you saw the different reactions to both the attacks and the reactions to what was going on in Cuba, what struck you as the most important to carry forward?
Well, you guys talked about horrible images, and let's start with bad images. And that was President Obama with the Castros when this happened, going ahead and going to the baseball game, and then going down to Argentina, dancing a tango. It's been now revealed that 2 Americans were killed. Looks like it was targeted against America. It happens in the capital of Europe, and you don't interrupt. You give 50 seconds to it. This is disappointing, but it's consistent with the president's attitude, which is kind of missing in action, benign neglect. Now, to the credit of the United States, under our commander-in-chief, it appears the number 2 in ISIS, the Islamic State, was killed. That's a good start. So it's a bad problem. And 600 people in Europe who had training with the Islamic State, and they just get to come back into a community like Molenbeek in Brussels, where they don't give up. Abdeslam, one of the perpetrators of the Paris atrocity, there's a big problem going on. And Donald Trump is talking about it, Patty. You want to bring up presidential candidates. You want to know why he's popular? Because we have a problem. We have to face up to it. These kind of enclaves in America, it's not a good thing. We don't have it, thank God, in America. I hope we never do. But a no-go zone for the cops, Sharia law in parts of your country, you talk about anti-American. I'd like to hear the American president speak about that quite a bit more.
Penn, one of the things that President Obama had mentioned when he was still at the baseball game and said, hey, part of my reaction is that life continues to go forward, which is what terrorists do not want to see. Did he make the right call? What did you make of the reaction to all the events?
I think he did make the right call, and what happened in Belgium is tragic, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think what's going on in Cuba is sort of related to it. When you look back at our history, one of the reasons Cuba became an enemy was due to the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Kennedy administration, and the tie there was Russia was sending weapons to Cuba, and our concern was that Russian weapons this close to U.S. soil. Well, Putin's behavior notwithstanding, we have somewhat normalized relationships with Russia and did that even as far back as the Reagan administration, but we still have isolated Cuba, and the question becomes why? Cuba didn't have the military strength to be a threat. Their only threat was because of their geographic location, their association with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union isn't quite what it used to be. So I think President Obama did the right thing by going to Cuba, by working to normalize relations, and quite frankly, his presence there and continued U.S. presence, notwithstanding the fact that we don't want to see McDonald's on every corner, but it's going to change how Cuba evolves and what happens there. And I would argue that it is going to eventually bring about a more democratic society. Maybe not directly reflective of what we have here in the U.S., but it's going to change Cuba over time. And I would argue that part of what's wrong with the Middle East is we don't know who to talk to and we haven't done a good job of being engaged with the right folks at the right time to stop some of this terrorist junk. Don't get me wrong, what the terrorists are doing is unacceptable, and it needs to be met with military and other forces to quell it. There's no excuse for bombing and blowing up a bunch of innocent people because you're angry at somebody. That's not acceptable. But our engagement in the Middle East historically has not worked the way we've done it in terms of supporting this dictator or that dictator and switching sides and arming some folks one month and then next month they're our enemies. So we've got to be in Cuba, but we've also got to deal with these terrorists. And I'm disappointed the Belgian authorities had the guy in custody and they were busy asking him about Paris rather than, what's with all the explosives you've got stashed in this other house. We have to do a better job as a global community coordinating with one another to deal with these terrorist threats.
John, what was the biggest takeaway for you after seeing all of these, some historical and some tragic global events this week?
Well, quite frankly, Paris and Brussels, it goes without saying, tragic events. Bottom line is there's a lot of backlash coming, toward the president for continuing with the trip to Cuba and to Argentina. But at the same time, you got to understand, the itinerary for these trips didn't just happen like, next week we'll go over there and next week we'll go down there. These have been planned out. The president can't turn around an itinerary in a day, in 2 hours. It's too bad they happened on the same day, quite frankly, because there would have been more time for thinking. But at the bottom line is, I'm sure the president was briefed, on what was going on in Belgium. I'm sure he knew what was going on. To get him to say, okay, well, I'm going to dump this 50-year, plan to, renegotiate with Cuba and they haven't been to Argentina. The president hadn't been to Argentina since the 90s as well. So the bottom line is, I think that was okay that he did that. I don't think that he could. Do you want the president to fly to Brussels and be right in harm's way? I don't think that's the answer either. But as Penn said, we have had a bad history of dealing with the Middle East, as has the rest of the world. This has been going on since 1099, since the Crusades. I don't know that it's ever going to end. I don't know how we get out of the morass. I don't know how we. Other than, as Penn also said, as we have to learn how to better deal with our friends in Europe and our friends in the Middle East, if we have any friends in the Middle East. I don't even know if we have any friends anymore. But the bottom line is, you've got to do something. When the Turks have this guy at the border and they tell the Belgian officials, hey, you got to do something with this guy. He's bad news. Don't let him in. And they let him in. So, you've got different levels of security in different countries around the world. Ours perhaps is the best, and the war has to be brought to us, so to speak.